we're going to have Naomi Tate introduce our speakers tonight, one of whom is Donna Poulton, who is another member of Westerners. What a great thing to be members of people, of a group that have these kind of people members. And then Donna and Jim will make their presentation.
Well, I just wanted to say how honored I am tonight to be able to do this. I met Donna Poulton for the first time in 2007 while she was here, and the grace that she spoke about Western art and all art, and the understanding that she had about techniques and about the artists and the love she had for it. And over the next few years, I got to meet her husband, Jim, and how the two of them worked together and always were so supportive of each other over the years in the different projects that they do. She was at the University of Utah Fine Arts Museum until 2015, and the two of us have been collaborating on lots of different projects since. We did my personal favorite one that we both worked on a whole lot for years was the Go West exhibit with the University of Utah Fine Arts Museum and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. And before we finished it, we had the Utah Symphony involved. We had a film study group involved. Donna did an Osher class at the University of Utah. It was just one wonderful thing after the other. And how she loves the West is how I feel about it too. And the other really great thing she did for me was introduce me to the Westerners. And she's been involved with that since 2008. So I really feel close sisterhood to Donna, and over the years I've got to feel the same love and respect for Jim. Also, they're both Western souls. Donna grew up in Dillon, Montana, where she spent much of her time on her grandfather's ranch. She lived and worked in Germany for 12 years and received her BA from Boston University in Stuttgart, and later her PhD in art and film history at Brigham Young University. And that's another thing. I love the old Western movies, and it's been so satisfying to me to be able to talk about imaging with her and all that. She's juried and curated many exhibits, including Bierstadt to Warhol, and that was at the University of Utah Fine Arts Museum, American Indians in the West, and Lacan Stewart Masterworks. She's written articles on Utah, Western art, and for Fine Art Connoisseur magazine, Western Art and Architecture, and many others. She is the co-author of Utah Art, Utah Artists, Painters of Utah Canyons and Deserts, Reuben Kirkham, Pioneer Artist, Lacan Stewart Masterworks, Painters of the Grand Teton National Park, co-authored with her husband Jim. And her current book that is going to be out within the next year, is that right? Is the Dictionary of Utah Fine Artists. That's co-authored with Vern Swanson and and that's going to be a real treat for all of us that are interested in Western artists of the past and right now too. And she's a proud member of Utah Westerners.
My proudest affiliation.
And now some about her husband, Jim. He's a psychologist in private practice in Salt Lake City and adjunct professor in psychology at the University of Utah, a faculty member of the International Psychotherapy Institute based in Washington, D.C. He is the author or co-author of 3 books on psychological theory and treatment. The one's called Internalization, the Origin and Construction of Internal Reality. Object relations and relationality in couple therapy, and exploring the middle ground. And his new book that came out in 2020 is Suffering and Sacrifice, the Clinical Encounter. He's also co-authored with his wife, Donna Poulton, 2 books on the history of the American West, Lacan Stewart Masterworks in 2012, and The Painters of Grand Teton National Park, which they will be talking about for us tonight. So with that, I'd like to Jim and Donna Poulton. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Naomi, for that fine introduction. I appreciate that. We both do. And thank you, Westerners, for inviting us to talk about our book. Donna and I are going to do this in 2 parts. I'll talk first. I'm going to talk about the earlier chapters in the book, which cover the eras of the trappers and traders, the eras of the expeditions and exploration, also the settlement of the areas around the Tetons, and the creation of the National Elk Refuge and the National Park. And then Donna will come up, and she's going to talk about our curatorial process in developing this book, how we designed it, and she'll talk about the contemporary artists, of which there are many, and they are really fascinating. As you can imagine, the Tetons have motivated a lot of creative activity, people trying to capture both what they look like and what the people feel as they watch look at the Tetons.
Hold the microphone. We can't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. How's that? Is that better? Okay. I won't repeat that. It wasn't very important anyway. Well, let me say that as you all know, whenever in America, especially, a new territory was explored, the earliest images of that territory were typically on maps. Right? So we began the book looking at maps. This is the first map to show the part of the world that contains the Tetons. And you can barely see it because it's really kind of scribbled, but there are the Tetons right there. And he got the information about this map from members of the Lewis and Clark expedition, other early trappers, not very many, but 1 or 2, and John Coulter, who had been with Lewis and Clark, but on their way back east, he decided he wanted to stay in the West, so he joined a trapping group, and he had quite the set of adventures. You can't see the detail here, but it includes a dotted line, which is purportedly John Coulter's journey through Jackson Hole, which he made in the winter without a horse. He walked 310 miles to get back to where he was centered during the trapping. And when he arrived, they didn't recognize him because he was almost dead. Okay, the next map that I wanted to show you. This is the first American map, actually the first map in the world that names the Tetons. You can see right here, right there is the word LES. This is in French. So les, and then there is TROIS, les trois, and down here TETONS, les trois Tetons. Right? So this is the very first map that names the Tetons. This map was created by Warren Ferris, who was in the first group that Jacob Astor sent to the West to stay year-round to trap and trade. He created this map in 1836. He tried to get it published. Nobody would publish it. So essentially it disappeared, and it was rediscovered in 1936, and it was published then. So this map, the first one to name the Tetons, I like the story of this map. You can see the Tetons right there, and here he talks about Jackson Hole, and Jackson Lake he calls Teton Lake, but he does call Yellowstone Lake Yellowstone Lake. So the names are shifting as we speak. There were no artists who captured the scenes except for one, and that was Alfred Jacob Miller. Alfred Jacob Miller accompanied Sir Thomas, what was his name? Sir William Drummond Stewart was his name. Alfred Jacob Miller accompanied him to attend the 1837 rendezvous in Wyoming. It was one of the last rendezvous, right? Because I'm sure, as many of you know, by 1840 the fur trade was rapidly disappearing, and the trappers were all disappeared soon after that. But Miller attended that rendezvous. It's estimated he did over 200 sketches while he was at the rendezvous. Most of them were plein air. Some of them he would take back to his tent and finish them in his tent. But all of them, he took back to his studio when they were done at the rendezvous. And for the rest of his life, he created paintings from those sketches. This is one of those paintings. This is called Trappers Starting for the Beaver Hunt. And it's dated 1858 to 1860. And it's a transcription, essentially, of the sketch he made in 1837. So once the trappers disappeared, the Teton area was relatively unvisited. There weren't a lot of people who went in. The next group that came was actually the first expedition that came to the Tetons. That was an expedition by William Reynolds. He was commissioned to go to map the area around Yellowstone and assess its value for resources and things like that. So he started in 1859, and in the winter of 1859, they stayed on the east slope of the Wind River Mountains. And then in the spring, they hit what they described as a butte that they couldn't get up and over. So what they did was they followed the Gros Ventre River, and they came upon the Tetons. They hadn't planned that, but that made them the first expedition to actually see the Tetons. Reynolds had two artists accompanying him. The first one was this fellow, J.D. Hutton. He did a sketch just as they came over the rise and saw the Tetons for the first time. All right? And look at that, I love this image. It's sort of brooding. It captures some of those gray days that can happen in the Tetons. The next one was the other artist. This is Anton Schonborn. We think that they did these two images sitting next to each other or near each other, although clearly there are very different images, very different moods in these images. These are, let me see. Yeah, let me give you a quote here, because the images are so different between Hutton and Schonborn. Let me read you what Reynolds wrote in his diary when they first saw the Tetons. He said, "Far off, a barrier apparently stretched across the valley in the form of a ragged cliff of brilliant red, above whose center shone with even greater brilliancy the snow-covered peaks of the great Teton, dazzling in the clear atmosphere with the reflected rays of the newly risen sun." Okay? Reynolds is great to read. He was a poet, and he was a very good writer. What happened was, once they got into Jackson Hole, they stayed there for just a few days. Then they went up over Teton Pass and down into what's now Teton Valley. At the time, people called it Pierre's Hole. This next image is of Schonborn, and the title of this image tells you where he was. This is Henry's Lake and the Tetons from the summit of Low Pass looking south. So this is an image on the west side of the Tetons that Schonborn painted. So this was in 1860. The next Fort Hall, and he split his party in half. One half went up into Montana in order to come down into Yellowstone. The other half went due east to explore the Tetons, right from the west side. Accompanying that party was William Henry Jackson, as you all know, the famous photographer and artist. This is an image that Jackson created. He called the Bighorn in the Tetons, Wyoming. He said that he got to this 11,000-foot ledge. I'll talk a little more about that in a second. And he was in his tent, and he opened his flap, and only 20 feet away was a mountain sheep. Jackson said he reached for his rifle. I know my eye never left that big ram, but suddenly, without a sound, he was gone. Okay. So this is a sketch of his little camp on that 11,000-foot ledge. There is a photograph, one of the most famous photographs from the Tetons. That photograph is called Photographing in High Places. This is taken from that 11,000-foot ledge. To reach this spot, Jackson had to abandon his mules and convince his assistants to carry his very heavy photographic equipment through steep snowfields and along perilous cliffs in order to get up there. But he wanted to get up there to get the view that he found there. Jackson's biographer said, this photograph is noted for illustrating the heroics necessary to discover, claim, and bring back some trace of the monumental, inhuman sublimity of the West. These guys were great with language, you know. Okay. Jackson liked the image so much, he did a watercolor of it right there, and he continued to paint that image through his life. This photograph is from a Look magazine photo shoot in 1840s, and you see Thomas Moran and his brother Peter. Moran, he knew about the Tetons. He might have seen them when he accompanied Hayden in an 1871 expedition that skirted the Tetons from the west. He might have seen them there, but he always wanted to return, and in 1879 he was able to. With a letter from Rutherford B. Hayes, he presented himself at Fort Hall, and the commander of Fort Hall gave him a military escort for them to go to the Tetons, into Teton Valley, and approach the Tetons from the west. These are two images painted from a distance, one by Thomas and one by Peter. The thing about that visit was, excuse me, there was a forest fire. There was smoke everywhere. They could barely see the Tetons from a distance. You can see that they both inserted smoke into their paintings to sort of capture what the moment actually was like for them. Another difficulty they ran into as they tried to go up the Teton River Valley was a black bear who wouldn't let them pass. And they tried and tried to distract it. They finally shot it in the foot, and the bear disappeared, and they kept on their way. This is a close-up painting of the Tetons that Thomas Moran did. This painting is just called The Tetons, and it's dated 1879, the same year as that little expedition he made. And here, just like William Henry Jackson, Thomas Moran painted the Teton images throughout his life. This is one he painted in 1895, and this painting is in the White House collection. Okay, so from 1880 onward, artists started coming to the Teton area. At first it was a trickle, but more and more they started to come, and it included the group of artists who appeared there to paint. Some famous artists: Carl Rungus, Frederick Remington, Charles Partridge Adams, William Robinson Lee, Henry Colmer. Lots of different artists started to make their way into the Tetons. At about the same time, Conrad Schwerin, the whole there year-round, came in 1883, in the winter of 1883 and 1884, 3 guys built a cabin and they made their way through the winter. And the next group to come, it came in 1889, and that was families came to settle the valley as well. But the conditions, as you know, were harsh, right? By the year 1900, only 638 people were living in Jackson Hole, and it was very difficult to get there. There were no roads. It wasn't until the 1920s that there were paved roads into Jackson Hole. And the closest train stop was all the way in Idaho, okay? Even with these harsh conditions, even given those harsh conditions, the settlements started to grow, the ranches started to grow, fences started to come into play. And what those fences did was they interrupted the migration of the elk. They had been migrating through that valley for a millennium, right? And those fences meant that they couldn't do it. So the elk started to starve to death. Right? In the winter of 1908 and 1909, one person who wrote the history of the area said that that was when one could walk miles on the strewn bodies of dead elk. So the community realized they had to do something. And they started lobbying for a reserve or a refuge for the elk. The leader of that lobbying effort was Stephen Leake. Stephen Leake was one of the real early comers. He arrived in 1886. Remember, the first guides were there in 1883. He arrived in 1886, and his photographs especially helped to convince Congress to create the elk refuge. At first it was very small, just like 2,700 acres, but now it's about 25,000 acres, okay? This is one of my favorite paintings. This is Tucker Smith. It's a long painting. This is called The Refuge. If any of you have been to the Wildlife Museum in Jackson, you will have seen this painting because it's very prominently displayed there. That's part of their permanent collection. Artists continue to come into the valley to paint. One of them was our own Alfred Lamborn, right? This actually was painted from the west side. You can tell because the mountain leans to the left. It's painted from the east, the mountain leans to the right, right? This is painted from the left side. Likely he got there by the train that was finished in 1879 that took you up toward Idaho Falls. Alfred Lamborn was known for being one of the first people to paint areas that nobody had painted before. In fact, people said that if an explorer thought they had discovered something new, they better check with Alfred Lamborn first. I love this quote from Alfred Lamborn: "The snow-clad Tetons, thrusting sharp peaks to heaven, to climb up there, nay, even your thought itself slides off." Great quote. So in the 1920s, the lobbying to create the national park got into full swing. It was ultimately created in 1929 with a rather small acreage, but it was expanded in the succeeding years to the point that it's now 310,000 acres. This is a poster for Grand Teton National Park that was created as part of a WPA project in 1938. The artist was C. Don Powell. We are lucky to have this poster. Doug Lean deserves our gratitude. He was a ranger in the park. He found this poster. Okay, now we're moving on, taking you rapidly through the development of artists in this area. Moving into the 1930s and 1940s, artists started coming into Jackson Hole and staying. Not all of them, most of them actually still came to visit and then left, but some started to stay and they started to create artist groups. One of those was this fellow, Olaus Muri. Great photo. This was with his wife, Marty, in 1953. Muri first came to the Tetons in 1927 as an elk expert. He had been commissioned by the federal government to study the elk herd and to do and to make recommendations for how to help preserve the elk herd. He was a world-renowned expert on the American elk. he was also an artist, and the books he wrote, he would illustrate with his own images. This is just one of them. I love this one too. This is just called Moose, and this was an illustration for one of his books about the wildlife in the Tetons. Another one of the artists who was there from early on is this fellow, Grant Olaf Hagen, also known as Tiny Hagen. And Hagen had a lot in common with Murray. Hagen was a biologist, also a part-time ski instructor, but at some point he decided to quit them all and devote his time full-time to being an artist. He was commissioned by Grand Teton National Park to create a series of murals. This, we think, is one of the images from those murals. It was hard to verify that, but we think this is from one of the murals that was set up at the wildlife, I can't remember the wildlife park near Moran in Wyoming. This is called Coyote and Ground Squirrel, or Coyote and Ground Squirrel. Another artist who spent a lot of time in the Tetons, Archie Boyd Teeter, also called Teton Teeter. Right? Teton Teeter first arrived in Jackson Hole in 1928, and he spent virtually every summer there for the rest of his life. His pattern was that he would come into the Jackson Hole, he'd work for the national park for a little while until he got enough money to be able to paint for the rest of the summer. And that's what he would do year after year after year. He opened one of the earliest art galleries on the square in Jackson. A little bit of trivia, the Cowboy Bar got its liquor license in 1937, the very first liquor license granted in Wyoming since the Prohibition. Okay. So this is the oldest drinking bar in Wyoming. Okay. Another one of the artists who was there year-round, and this artist essentially was sort of he was like the pillar of art in Jackson Hole. This is Conrad Schwerin. He is well known. He encouraged other artists. He was a fixture in Jackson Hole, and also, as you can see, he was a very fine artist. This is called Snow Headquarters. Schwerin arrived in Jackson Hole just after World War II, and he ran an art gallery in the Wart Hotel for many years. So this one is called Snow Headquarters. This one is another one of Schwerin's called Mountain Moonlight. Now, the Tetons, as you all know, it's an area for people to come to play. Mountain climbing, skiing, hiking, camping, all of that, of course, and tourism, right? These were all the kinds of activities that were really driving the development of the art group, the artists around the Tetons. One of those people was this fellow, Paul Petzl. Paul Petzl first came to the Tetons in the 1920s. He began leading mountain climbing trips into the Tetons in 1924 when he was 16, right? So your guide up the Grand Teton was a 16-year-old, but he was so good. He was a world-renowned mountain climber. He started the American School of Mountaineering, and he started the National Outdoor Leadership School, NOLS, as I'm sure many of you know of that. It still is going. This is an image of Paul Petzl, painted in 1971 by Alvin Gittins, our Utah artist. Petzl was one of the real fixtures of Jackson Hole. Post-war, with the improvement of roads and the improvement of 1946, Hopper and his wife took a tour of the entire West. They stopped in Grand Tetons. That first image is an image of his wife in the passenger seat of the car, painting, right? And the second image is called The Slopes of the Grand Teton. Both of them led to paintings. Let me show you this one. This is watercolor and graphite pencil. And he has her in the passenger seat, partly because she needs the room to paint, but also because Edward Hopper would never let her drive the car. It pissed her off throughout the entire trip. Right? He wouldn't let her drive. So I love this image too, because Hopper is in the back seat painting Joe in the front seat painting Mount Moran, right? I think that's a great image. We threw this one in. We both love this painting. Although this is a recent one. This was done in 2014 by a California artist, Robert Townsend. And you see, though, that it quotes the 1950s. Those cars, if there are any car experts in here, I'm sure you can tell me the years of some of those models. But my guess they're about 1954, something like that, because they look just like the car my dad had when I was 4 years old in 1954. Let me read you what we write about Robert Townsend. The novelties and mementos from prior decades were the inspiration for Robert Townsend's Greetings from Jackson Hole. For this large-scale photorealist painting, Townsend appropriated ephemera from the 1950s popular culture, the greeting card, the postcard, and the automobile culture. He takes the image and the historic capital of the iconic cowboy bar and shifts it to a different context, raising it to fine art. There is a moment of confusion, though, excuse me, for the viewer of this work, which we call a postmodern work. The juxtaposition of the photographic perfection of the oil painting with the unexpected text, having a great time in Jackson Hole, wish you were here and miss you, catches the viewer off guard. The personal message mobilizes an uneasy self-reflection based on the realization that the viewer, too, has written on their own postcard almost identical words that are now so capture so much about the history of Jackson Hole. So I'm going to end with a couple of stories about the perils of painting plein air. Connie Schwerin, that I told you about earlier, he was a plein air purist. He painted all of his canvases, some of them very large, plein air, no matter what the weather. And through the history of Jackson Hole, the people have really devoted themselves to painting outdoors, no matter what the weather. One of them was this guy. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed one. This is Lacan Stewart. Lacan Stewart was one of the people who started visiting Jackson Hole as a tourist and as a painter after World War II. This is an image from 1948. He calls it Ramblin' Sage and Pines, Teton National Park. And on that same trip, he made this painting, a beautiful painting of Mount Moran. My apologies, but I got ahead of myself. I'll get back to the plein air story in just a minute. But the next image I want to show you is another one of those painters who came to Jackson Hole partly to paint and also partly to do the activities that were there. This is a gorgeous painting. This is by Roy Kurzweil. He was a British citizen. He arrived in Jackson Hole in the early 1950s and stayed there for the rest of his life. He was a mountain climber and a skier, but he was also obviously a very good painter. This is one of the great images, but there are several Roy Kurzweil images that are really, really beautiful. Okay, now to the perils of painting plein air. This is Greg Mccuron. Greg died about. This is one of his finished paintings. So this story. Greg was painting in Yellowstone, and he was on a little knoll, looking out over a vista. And he heard the screech of brakes behind him. And he turned around and he saw a guy with a camera running toward him. The guy wasn't running to photograph Greg. The guy was running to photograph a buffalo herd that was between Greg and the guy, right? The guy's running triggered a stampede. And the buffalo turned and came straight at Greg. He was there just with his easel, just like in that picture you saw. And the buffalo herd came barreling down on him. He stood behind his easel, frozen to the spot. They did not touch the easel, although they brushed past him. Right? They were within inches of trampling him, and it was a big enough herd. But that's one of the perils of plein air painting. Great story. This is a photograph by Wes Newton. Wes is an Oklahoma painter. He was painting in the Tetons with his friend John Hughes, a Utah painter. And Wes was painting a tree. That tree right there. He was painting that little crop of trees. And John Hughes noticed that that right behind the tree was a brown bear, right? And they said, whoa, we better get out of here. So they backed up a bit, but they took pictures while this brown bear came out and was extremely curious about the easel and the paints, pawed the paints, sniffed the paints, looked at the easel, and eventually just kind of went back into the forest. But the sorts of things I guess you have to watch out for if you're going to do plein air painting. Finally, this is an image by Tucker Smith, which also just sort of captures the feeling of being in the Tetons. This is called Cook Tent. It's morning. The longtime resident of Jackson Hole by the name of Harold Ballou, B-A-L-L-E-W. And Harold lived in Jackson Hole from 1907 to 1995. He was the caretaker of the Startled Doe and the Flying Goose ranches. And he wrote this poem. We really like this poem. Rode up to Wart's old livery barn. Steve Callahan was there. He said, get down, son, chat a while, and give your horse some air. Might just as well spend the night. I said, thanks, that's what I'll do. Tomorrow I'll be heading out, 'cause I'm just passing through. Well, 60 years have come and gone, and things are not the same. What hair I have is snowy white, left hip kind of lame. My campfire coals have glowed and cooled, ashes scattered to the wind. The trail is getting shorter now, not too long to the end. But I love old Wyoming, and I'm leaving her to you. Enjoy, but treat her gently, friend, 'cause we're all just passing through. Okay, and now for Donna. The better half of
When our fellow Westerner, Gibbs Smith, asked me to write the history of painting in the Tetons, I suggested that Jim co-author with me. Jim is an excellent researcher, has a killer eye, and I wanted to share this irresistible assignment with him. At the outset, we didn't know that a book on paintings of the Tetons had never been written. So that came as a surprise to us. There was nothing that had a list of artists that had ever been there. We didn't really know where to begin. There were books on individual artists, but not a group of artists. So it was a weighty challenge that Gibbs had given to us. Over many good meals, we discussed the parameters of the book, which we thought should include the following. The book should be comprehensive. It should start in the beginning, exactly where Jim started, and that was the perfect place, getting the earliest images we possibly could. We were allowed, roughly from Gibbs, 370 images to depict in the book. We realized early on that 370 images of page after page of the Tetons, no matter how beautiful they were, was going to become tedious. So what we decided to do was to include animals, and we decided to include the town of Jackson Hole, which would really spice the book up a little bit. Since a book had never been written, how were we to know who had been there? That was a big question. So we started by visiting Jackson Hole. We looked at the galleries, the museums, the private sections. I think many of you have heard. It was, if you're too tired to go to the next place to look at a painting, you better do it. And we never regretted it. So that's one thing we did. We did a tireless look of the area. Then we asked ourselves who we would like to have in the book. I mean, how fascinating would that be if you said, these are the greatest artists in the world, these are the greatest artists in America, and we want to have them in the book. So we listed people, hundreds of them. Thomas Akins, Guy Rose, Emil Gruba, Winslow Homer, Charlie Russell, Andy Warhol, Maynard Dixon, Georgia O'Keeffe. Those are just a few, very few, of the artists we listed. We read their biographies, looked through catalog raisonnés, called their gallerists, checked other auctions. These artists either never made it to the Tetons or didn't mention the trip, or we couldn't find a painting that they painted. But for every 10 who didn't make it, one person on our wish list did. Artists like Thomas Moran, Birger Sanson, Frederick Remington, Frank Tenney Johnson, Conrad Buff, Thomas Hart Benton, and we were most thrilled about Edward Hopper, who created Nighthawks. So this important American artist actually made it to the Tetons, and Jim showed you some pictures from that. We also found a lot of Utah artists, and we haven't mentioned those. Paintings of the Teton area. From that, we reduced it to 1,100. From that, we did the really hard, painful work of reducing it to 370. So say you have a great wildlife piece, something that's just absolutely beautiful, but you can't use it because you need a Jackson Hole piece. And those are the kinds of the decisions we had to make. It was really tough. So, let's see here. So I brought this painting back because I wanted to talk about how we decided a little bit on things. This is the front cover of the book. Does anybody recognize the artist? Clyde Aspaveg. He's a Montana artist. And you know, Jim and I had really great ideas on what should be on the cover, but you should all know that the author never gets the final decision. It's always the publisher. And so we looked at it and we thought, what better book, what better picture could we actually have put on the cover than this Clyde Aspaveg? You can see it's the Snake River, aptly named because it winds and winds and winds back into the foothills, and then you've got the trees kind of with this rhythm going backward, and it's a vertical, and it was the perfect thing to put on the book. The next painting I put in here was by Jim Wilcox. He is a Teton painter. He's lived in the Tetons his entire life. I put this in here because the first 4 trips that I made to Jackson Hole, I never saw the Tetons. They were completely surrounded in clouds, and I thought, okay, this painting, it kind of sums up my experience of living in Tetons. He lived in New York, and he also lived in Wapiti, just outside the east entrance of Yellowstone. And this would be a painting he did when he was traveling into the Tetons. So that was the back jacket. This is a painting that was done by Dan Young, and we kept coming on this painting all the time thinking, wow, that's an incredibly dramatic painting, and we wanted it as the frontispiece so that when you opened the book, you were as shocked by this as we were. And you had to look at it, you had to think about it, because oftentimes you think of bears coming out of the woods or coming out of someplace else, but definitely not out of the river that you're standing next to. So, okay, so I am going to start with, and Jim, will you track time for me? I was really enamored with the ranching and the cowboy heritage chapter. And this painting was done by Carl Rungus. He's probably one of the most famous wildlife painters in America and in Canada, but he loved painting Western ranching scenes in Wyoming, and he would come to Wyoming to paint. And I thought I would just recite this little piece from Nathan Burt, who was a citizen of Jackson Hole, and he's talking about ranching in the 30s. And first of all, I have to say, You know, everybody dreams of what they would have, where they could have lived in the 30s or 40s, and I always lived there in the 1930s. But this is how this one citizen described it. It was a classless society full of class, where the swagger of Western horsemen blended on equal terms with the swagger of adventurous, anti-conventional Eastern society. Everyone, ranchers, Jackson storekeepers, hired hands, dudes, were caught up in this society, involved in the intense feuds and friendships, the bitter causes, park extension, and related problems. They took sides, cheated on each other selling horses and playing poker, loved, hated, and even married each other. So that was kind of Jackson Hole in a nutshell at that time. Okay, the growing season was really short. So really the only industry Jackson Hole had was growing hay and feeding cattle all winter long. But it always didn't make ends meet, so they had a lot of dude ranches. And this is one of the most famous dude ranches, the Triangle X Dude Ranch. This is a rodeo, the elbow rodeo in the 1920s and 30s. And I thought, you know, I don't know what the seconds are. This guy has to stay on this horse, but I bet he never gets off, because who wants to fall on those sagebrush, those nasty sagebrush? The Saturday Evening Post, this was done by John Clymer. He was one of the most prolific magazine cover painters in America, second only to Norman Rockwell. And he retired in the Tetons, and this is one of the works that he did. This is Thomas Hart Benton, and many of you may see him in order to repaint something that was original, and that is certainly what he did. This was during a time when ranchers had kind of given up cattle in Jackson Hole and had used sheep instead because they could make more money. But you can see this memento mori here of the cow head, and of course the memento mori had to do with saying, yes, you know you are going to die, continue to remember that. And they did that in the Renaissance in a lot of still life paintings. Conrad Schwerin, Jim mentioned, this is when a feller needs a hand rescuing this little calf out of the willows. This is a Tucker Smith. I love this painting, and I love it because it has that grand old fireplace. It has the cowboy coffee sitting there. It has this branch that you take off an old dead tree and you feed it into the fire to keep it going. These are kind of the way people camped in the old days, and I really love it. This is Jason Rich. He is a Utah artist, and I just wanted to give you an idea of his painting style. This picture was used for Jackson Hole. It was the poster that they used for all of their art festivals. This is a close-up of this shirt. So this shirt should be white, but look at it. Look at how painterly this is. The whites are blended in with the blues and the grays and the mauves and the purples. And all of that turns into a white shirt that has sun shining on it. So it's a really brilliant way of painting. This is another Tucker Smith, possibly my most favorite painting. And this is because these cattlemen are taking the cattle down from grazing up in the mountains. This is probably a fall day. It's cold, but it's warm. And you don't see these guys out chasing the cows. They're not roping the cows. They're just herding the cows down and enjoying the day. And I can imagine that kind of day, how beautiful it would be. And they're driving them along the drift fence. It's sometimes called a drift fence, sometimes a buck and rail. In Montana, it's called a jack fence. Another jack fence, the artist said that this fell down the next year. This is another jack fence, but he's taking the ideas of old photography where you capture the blur in photography and where you kind of capture the garish colors. So you can see down here, none of these colors are blended. Even in the sky here, none of these colors are blended. Each have their own color. And that was kind of a new technique in painting. This is a painting by a naive artist, Kathy Wiffler. She's self-trained. I think many of you over the years have seen these kinds of haying scenes where there's a beaver slide, where there's a buck rake, where there's a hoist. This is the hoist that takes it up, the hay, and they create these beautiful old bread loaf kind of haystacks. This was my job when I was a kid growing up on my grandpa's ranch. It was really boring, but I read all the best books of the time. And this is what it is today. So we no longer have those kind of family farms where everybody pitches in and hays. Now you have these kind of undefined mountains. You have these bales of hay, and it's become very modern and in a way very stale. Peter Nisbet painting, I'm gonna have to pick it up here really quick. Very abstract, but when you put it in a context, you can see the rock and the aspen tree in the background. Again, here's the detail. He's loaded the brush with different colors. He's able to put that brush on the canvas and paint with several colors instead of mixing it on the palette. Another artist from Colorado trying to get a vantage point on the Snake River where he can go as far back as possible and take in the atmospheric perspective. Kyle Sims, wildlife artist, you've got that old bull there saying, come on, hurry up guys, let's get across the river. This is Dustin Van Weckel, and this is kind of a cute story. Where is he? He says, this is called The Interlopers. And he's described these ravens as really smart bums. They like to follow bears and get an easy meal. But he makes it more dramatic with the clouds and the old trees behind him. Again, a Clyde Aspaveg. This is a Phil Epp, who's paints a lot like Thomas Hart Benton, where the clouds actually echo the movement and the style of the mountains. So you've got the three peaks and very nicely done. Sandy Walker would get up every morning. These paintings are like 10 feet by 10 feet, and he'd store them in a barn. But he wanted to get the feeling of the paint, of the area. So he would put these pieces of paint down on big brushes, kind of in a percussion kind of way, just laying them on the canvas to get the feel of the area. I'll pass this one, I'll pass that one. This is Billy Shank. This was another Teton poster. And I wanted to show you this because we've talked about soft edges. These are hard edges. Look how hard those are. There is no mixing of that paint whatsoever. And this is his style that he's become very successful with. Again, almost the same horse, looks like paint on numbers, no blending whatsoever. Toasting all the animals, saying nobody's gonna get killed today. And all the animals are agreeing not to eat each other either. And I put this in here because we came across a group of paintings that really described the peaceable kingdom. And they all kind of came at once, and I'm just gonna show you two of them. This is Amy Ringholz. And she writes, the title of it is Dreamers Don't Sleep. And Amy writes, the painting is about hope and dreams, that anything is possible. It's about coming together, and then who knows really what goes on in the middle of the night. So all of these artists together. The next one is very similar. And this is by Robert Macaulay. And it is titled, Meanwhile in Another Part of the Woods, and it's actually written on the painting. The writing on this painting is a postmodern device that subverts the viewer's attempt to read the painting, which means that we're kind of distracted by the writing. It calls on our intertextual knowledge of painting and myth with Leda and the Swan. You can see Leda and the Swan. Other mythological references, especially turtles with the weight of the world on their back. So there's this one with the weight of the world on the back, and there's the turtle and the hare, because I don't know what's going on there. So, and the next painting is Mark Eberhard. This is in the Elk Refuge. This was also used as one of the Teton posters. You're showing a lot of negative space. This is Mike Peugeot. This is called Capturing Silence. Have any of you ever been in a ski line when you have a lot of people and it's snowing, but it's really quiet? And the snow is absorbing all of the sound. And that's what he was trying to capture here. And of course, there's a lot of skiing in the Tetons. The next one is called Still Moment. This is after the avalanche, and it recalls Bruegel's After the Hunt. So it's done in these tones, black, gray, browns. They're walking across the top of the hill in snow, and it's a really very somber image. This is a painting called Barcode, and it's a metaphor for spending more time outdoors and less time changing money. He was out cross-country skiing in a pine forest in flat light, and it occurred to him that this all looked like a barcode, so he painted it. The last paintings I'm going to look at very quickly. Jim and I were able to Skype with this artist when he was in China. The painting on the left is Teton. The painting on the right is Jenny Lake. And each one of these squares and each one of these rectangles has 30 to 50 layers of paint. So if you put your hand over the painting, it undulates because it goes between, you know, the lines and then the actual paint that's on the painting. And he wanted you to feel what he felt when he woke up in the morning, this overwhelming feeling of the spirituality of the Tetons. So we went from really representational early on with Jim to something that was almost completely abstract and color field, but also meant something very much to these artists of the Tetons. So went through that rather quickly because we're out of time, but do you have any questions for us? Steve.
This might be correct, not correct for the book, but it is. Do you have any anecdotal stories about working with Gibbs? How did Gibbs come up with this idea? And how involved was he? Jacqueline, I know there's connections with the valley and all that.
Right. I know Catherine could probably speak to this more. But I remember Jim and I and another artist met Gibbs in Jackson Hole at the Cafe Genevieve, and we had a really nice talk, and he loved the Tetons. I mean, you know that, Catherine. I mean, this was a really special place for him, and he really wanted to see this book done, and he had done quite a bit of painting of the area himself. And so we talked about ideas. I think he really was set initially on having just images of the actual mountains, but we talked it over, and we talked about wildlife, and we talked about the scene in Jackson Hole. I know one thing that Gibbs was never very fond of were ranchers. He didn't like ranching, and that was kind of interesting because, of course, that was my background, so we devoted a chapter to that, but he never said anything about it, and he liked it, and we should have included it here, one of the really great paintings that he did. You know, Gibbs was a good painter, and so I'm glad that the books that we've done over time, we have some of his works, but I know the area meant a lot to him.